Story 1. Just because it has not been useful to me yet, does not mean it was not useful. There are probably many things that would have been useful if I had paid more attention. Story 2. People complain about school not teaching critical thinking and then come here to complain about subjects designed to develop critical thinking. Story 3. In high school, I resigned myself to the I am never going to use this mentality. In college, I was frustrated that I was forced to take general education classes instead of loading up on science courses that I really wanted to take. I realized much later in life that a little bit of understanding in any of those topics opens up the ability to relate to another person's interests and communicate with them. This is not the most conventional way to think about the usefulness of subject matter, but it is how my mind shifted course on what I once considered useless education. Story 4. Inaccurate sex education. My high school actually taught us that French kissing would directly lead to pregnancy. I grew up in a rather conservative Christian family and knew that wasn't true. I tried to dispute that with the teacher, but he sent me to the office for insubordination. Thankfully, about half of my classmates left the room and went to the office with me to defend me and say that I was not being insubordinate and had presented a mature, professional argument against an obviously false statement. I didn't get in trouble because while my classmates were defending me, I called my mom on my secret cell phone. My parents didn't know I had one, and put the conversation on speaker so she could hear what was going on. My mom was upset that school was teaching such incorrect information and that I got sent to the office. She threatened to send my dad in to have a conversation with the vice principal. My dad is very overprotective of me and flat out scary when he's mad. I got to test out of the sex education unit of health class and was put into a different health class with a different teacher. Story 5. Looking back on it now, I would say none of it. Back then, I thought English, including grammar and vocabulary, and social studies or history were useless. Now I am thankful for enduring them since I understand the references people use. Story 6. I went to school in Alabama where they taught us that the Civil War was not about slavery. That is deliberate misinformation. When I was a kid, they forced me to write in cursive by saying that in high school they would give you a 0 if you did not write in cursive. This was in the 1990s. My brother wrote in cursive on a quiz in the 7th grade and got a 0 because the teacher could not read cursive. Story 7. Impossible to answer accurately since the most useless things have long been forgotten due to their lack of usefulness. Story 8. Nothing is useless. Some subjects just seem useless because of how schools and teachers teach them. Over time, the education system has taught subjects in a way that convinces students they are learning only for the sake of compliance or graduating, when it should be the opposite. Students have to enjoy learning to truly understand things that they can only grasp by looking beyond textbooks and scores. Story 9. Wow, there are some incorrect responses here. One of the biggest benefits of school is learning how to learn. Even if the specific facts are not useful day to day, you can gain skills in how to do research, determine the credibility of sources, interpret numerical data, and draw rational conclusions. People not understanding the simple fact is why, as adults, they complain about not knowing about taxes, budgeting, investing, compound interest, and so on. You can teach yourself any of those things on the internet these days. Story 10. Do they still try to push the George Washington wooden teeth story? It is a strange fact to include in any lesson. No young child wonders about the first president's teeth, and it is completely false since his teeth were actually made from those of enslaved people. The only purpose of teaching this seems to be to create a hypernational anchoring bias. Story 11. College required me to pay for a 3-credit-hour freshman experience class. It was about attending events on campus. It has not helped me in the real world at all and cost me approximately $1,200. Story 12. Not what you asked, but classes in mandatory home and personal finances, along with basic household repairs, could be useful to all students. Story 13. You should never fight bullies or bullying on your own. Instead, report it to the school authorities. Story 14. A lot of physical education seems ineffective. In many schools, it is tailored to directly benefit those with the aptitude and skill to play competitive sports, but offers little for anyone else. Add to that the number of adults I have met with lifelong damage to their bodies specifically from playing sports in high school, and it sometimes seems to be a net detriment to public health. I am not against competitive sports, but I think the overemphasis displaces useful health education. Story 15. It is a general education. They may not know, and you may not know what you will need in college or in life. So it may end up being useless to you, but it may be important to someone else. Story 16. Thinking back on it, there are many more things I wish they had taught than not taught. At least another couple of semesters worth of material. Critical thinking and logical fallacies. Personal finance and basic information on bills and how to navigate health insurance. Even though I dislike project management, it would have been helpful to have at least a few weeks' overview of how it works. It would have been beneficial to be taught evolution. Both of my teachers who were supposed to teach it chose not to because of their personal beliefs. Story 17. That absolutely horrible behavior is something you need to tolerate and placate instead of just removing it from the workplace. Story 18. If you apply yourself, nothing is useless. Even if it is a subject you will never use again, the process of struggling to learn it has carved neural pathways that you will use for something else. Studying for your real estate license, memorizing the occupational safety and health administration rules on a job site, or even just putting together that bookcase that has only pictures and instructions in a language you cannot read. Story 19. Almost every topic has use beyond the surface-level concept. The truly useless lessons were conveyed through subtext. Behaviors like demanding respect without demonstrating it, refusing to explain the reasons for rules and decisions, and denying or shirking responsibility for mistakes were common. Among the adults we were expected to learn from, children are not stupid, but they are deeply impressionable. In many ways, the immaturity and lack of professionalism displayed by many teachers and administrators teach children, by example, how to conduct themselves as they grow and leave the school system. Story 20. There were 9 planets in our solar system. I made a foam model and everything. Then they reclassified Pluto and acted as if it never existed. Story 21. The entirety of physical education after 5th grade is unnecessary for me. I am a track athlete and train 4 times a week, so there is no reason for me to participate other than the requirement. I understand that physical education is intended for kids to exercise, but half the class just sits while the physical education teacher does nothing. Story 22. I hated gym because it was all sports. I would much rather run, do many push-ups, and be sore than play sports. Story 23. I think the only things I have never used are vectors and matrices. However, if you are in the armed forces, a pilot, or anyone who needs to use latitude and longitude, this kind of information would be useful for you. Story 24. My middle school forced us to take 3 worthless classes instead of the shop classes that were actually useful. As the oldest female of 7 children, I already knew cooking, sewing, and child care. The classes had us make useless projects such as aprons and master mix, which I would never use. I would have loved to make the metal shop projects instead. Story 25. For me personally, it is geometry proofs. I understand the importance of showing your work and proving your math, but proofs never clicked for me. I was very glad when I finished geometry and could move on without those proofs. Story 26. Not the system in general, but my particular 1st grade teacher spent 2 full days teaching us how to clean the bottom of a fish tank with a straw. To this day, I cannot figure out why. Generally, learning about dinosaurs is pretty useless considering how much it is focused on in school. How is knowing the various dinosaurs going to help me in life? Story 27. I spent years learning how to find X in mathematics class, yet somehow I still cannot find my keys when I am late for class. Story 28. For me, it has specifically been imaginary numbers in mathematics and only that. But just because it has been useless so far does not mean I will never get use from it, such as if I manage my chronic illness symptoms better and get a job in some science field. Story 29. How to play sports. Physical education is all about learning the rules to every sport instead of how to exercise and be healthy, which is confusing to me. Story 30. Facts without context. We learned facts, but not why we learned them. Haha. So we do walk around with calculators in our pockets. Yes, sure. How useful is that in everyday interactions? You also have a dictionary in your pocket, But are you going to keep up in a conversation with someone who speaks English much better than you? The powerhouse of the cell. You do not need to know this. What you do need to know is how science works. This is just one example. Ironically, we were always told to show our work, but the teachers did not show theirs. So we learned the answers, but not how they were found, which is the actual valuable lesson. Story 31. All education is necessary and can be used in some way. It depends on being in a situation that actually requires that education. Story 32. Everyone is different. For me, it was any kind of advanced mathematics. There is not a single time any of that theoretical material has come up in my life, except for maybe geometry. I say this because I put a lot of effort into trying to get good marks, but I was just grinding my own gears on something I was not talented at and was never going to use. I am sure it stimulated my mind in high school, but in hindsight, I would have been much better off filling my timetable with shop classes, because that is ultimately what I ended up doing. Story 33. Maybe Old Greek and Old Latin. Not entirely useless, though. They provide insight into some fundamental elements of language and culture. Story 34. My remote high school once hired a well-known speaker from the city. He was paid close to 40,000 Indian rupees, approximately $460, to speak over 2 days. The sessions were split into 3, 2, and 2 parts. We were kids back then, so we accepted whatever was given. Looking back, nothing he said made any sense. Story 35. Formulas that no one uses. Calculate the discriminate, find x through the quadratic equation if. Reality. How much will I have left on my card after utilities? Story 36. How would one know at that age? Sure, I learned a lot of things I never use, but who knows, maybe some of that I use without recognizing it. It is rather about how good the teacher is and if they do it for a paycheck or because they want to make you smarter. Story 37. I took a course in college to help an autistic person get a job. They did not have the funds to provide work experience, so we went around B&Q and had to paint a wall. I asked how this would help me get a job. She told me to stop backchatting. Story 38. It is not the information itself but the way it is taught. School is supposed to teach you how to think, yet many teachers and curricula focus more on memorizing facts for a test than on ingraining concepts into your mind. I would say everything is useful in some way. Story 39. Taught, not teach, since I don't know what it is like now. But sex education was abysmal when I was in school. We were given a 5-minute speech about heterosexual intercourse with penetration, and then told to do group projects on sexually transmitted diseases. One of the groups did not even do a project on sexually transmitted diseases because they did not know what they were. I would say that was pretty useless compared to what it should have been. Story 40. The best thing for being sad, replied Merlin, beginning to puff and blow, is to learn something. That is the only thing that never fails. You may grow old and trembling in your anatomies. You may lie awake at night listening to the disorder of your veins. You may miss your only love. You may see the world about you devastated by evil lunatics or know your honor trampled in the sewers of baser minds. There is only one thing for it then, to learn. Learn why the world wags and what wags it. That is the only thing which the mind can never exhaust, never alienate, never be tortured by, never fear or distrust, and never dream of regretting. Learning is the only thing for you. Look what a lot of things there are to learn. T.H. White, the once and future king. Story 41. College sociology, the one specific part one remember was so straightforward. We are all social actors. A mailman plays the role of a mailman. A doctor plays the role of a doctor. Story 42. Not all mathematics will be useful to you just because a teacher says it will be. For example, calculus. I do not know what I was thinking taking up for unit mathematics. However, I found that decimals, fractions, and algebra can be useful. Calculations involving angles, shapes, and three-dimensional geometry have been helpful as well. Anything beyond that is unnecessary for most people, as it does not impact their everyday life. Story 43. The Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program taught us that if we smoked marijuana, we would get addicted to heroin. However, this approach backfired and made children want to use drugs more. Woodworking class is useful for young people who might go into construction. Otherwise, in my opinion, it is fairly useless unless you plan to build your house by hand and can invest in expensive power tools. Story 44. Depends on the school. Creationism, often taught as an alternative to scientific reality, is harmful. Story 45. Cursive writing. Like, brother, don't waste my time. You could have taught 7-year-olds tax law, but instead, they write like the elderly. Story 46. Ensino religioso e educação sexual. Os ensinamentos escolares são inúteis, são tabu e ensinam errado. Story 47. History. The narratives taught are almost always centered around cisgender white men instead of the Black, Indigenous, and people of color and Latinx communities who actually built the world we live in. Story 48. Probably the anti-drug information. As a young teenager, all it did was give me ideas. I had no idea you could get high from solvents, so after that lesson, everyone went home and tried it because they were taught how simple it is. I also think the way they taught anti-smoking was ineffective and done by people who do not understand why people try smoking or how addiction really works. Story 49. I have yet to find a realistic use for psychology outside of naming certain disorders for fun, especially since it was only 9 weeks. Story 50. In my humble opinion, history. Is it helpful to know? Sure. Will you ever need it as a practical life skill? Absolutely not. Or at least not unless you are planning on entering a career field based on history specifically. Story 51. I don't even know where to start, to be honest. It's either the revisionist history or the useless mathematics. Story 52. In 2010, I took a computer class in high school that mostly taught Flash and Dreamweaver. It felt useful at the time, and hindsight is always 20/20, but these tools were replaced by technologies like HTML5 shortly after. Story 53. My sports education was like this. Now we play a kind of sport for a number of times, then you get graded on how good you are. I was totally exhausted after the warm-up. I needed to pretend to be as good as I could just to participate. Story 54. Pretty much all knowledge is useful given the proper context. Could simply be a lack of creativity to apply what has been learned. Story 55. Cursive. We pretend it is important because it is how adults write, but that is not true. Every older person I know who still uses cursive in their day-to-day writing has illegible handwriting. The worst print writing is still legible, but if your cursive is not on point and perfect, it is utterly unreadable. Story 56. Mathematics. Calculator. Drama. TikTok. Science. ChatGPT and National Geographic. English. Grammarly. This proves that school is useless. Story 57. In college, I was required to pay for unrelated classes that had nothing to do with my major. I completed 4 years of well-rounded education in high school, so I did not see the need to repeat the same courses for another year and a half at higher costs. Story 58. Old European history. Sure, there are lessons to be learned, but nobody has ever asked me who the King of England in 1582 was in my adult life. Story 59. The proper way to say larger numbers is 850, or $8.50, not $8.50. It is 1176, not 1776, not 1776. Do not use and either. It is 1969, not 1969 or 1969. No, I am not making this up. I have never met anyone who went to a different grade school than I did who learned this otherwise. Story 60. I understand that not everyone has this experience, but I had to learn theology, specifically the Bible, at my school. My entire family and I are not religious at all, but it was the only safe school in the area. I remember getting an F in that subject as well. Story 61. Synthetic division. I loved using it, but I have not found an excuse to use it since. Leggings are always inappropriate unless covered by a skirt that is at least fingertip length. Also, in my health class in high school, they taught us that we will be mistreated by male friends. Story 62. Inaccurate sex education information in my socially and politically conservative American hometown. I agree that no knowledge is truly useless, but only if that knowledge is actually accurate. Story 63. There is no useless knowledge. If I had to choose one, perhaps Jesus. However, it helped me understand why people are so influenced by it. Story 64. Cursive writing was supposedly used by all of the higher grades. Then computers came out and made it completely useless. Story 65. Abstinence education. Giving children accurate information about topics like sex, drugs, and other risky behaviors makes them less likely to engage in those behaviors. If a child is old enough to ask where babies come from, they are old enough to be told basic facts. Children need to know their body parts. If someone is acting inappropriately, a child can more easily report what happened. It is important to provide this information to protect children. Story 66. I would argue that the most useless thing taught at my school was cursive writing. Not because I think cursive is useless, but because they stopped teaching it partway through. The school-wide curriculum changed while I was there between 3rd and 4th grade, and they restructured many classes and subjects. Cursive writing was discontinued. At least I know how to sign my name. Story 67. When I was going through it, it was religion. Not because it is not useful, but because it was ripe with Christian propaganda and excluded all of the other world religions. It was a total waste of my time and I gained zero knowledge. Story 68. As much as I hated it, first, outer, inner, last in algebra. As much as I loved it, imaginary numbers in Algebra 2 and pre-calculus. Story 69. Integrity. Have you seen the current President of the United States of America? Have you seen any of his cabinet members, family, or personal advisors? Clearly, integrity is not integral to success. Disappointing and shameful. Story 70. I cannot say one useless thing, but my school system decided to teach us the same events in history for 7 years straight instead of actually teaching all of the different events. I did not even learn about the Chicago fires, but we learned about them getting the first skyscraper. Why could I not learn more history instead of reinforcing the same thing year after year? Story 71. Any type of more in-depth algebra. In my experience, I have used basic algebra plenty of times. I am pretty sure 90% of everyone here has used some form of basic algebra before and did not even realize they were doing it, but any type of advanced algebra, in my opinion, unless you are in a specific field that uses it regularly, is worthless. Save the advanced algebra for college or job training for those specific jobs that require it. Instead, in school, we could use the time we would dedicate to advanced algebra to teach finances. Teach about the importance of credit, how to file taxes, and actual important information that everyone needs to know to be a successful adult. Again, just my opinion. Story 72. I cannot speak for United States schools, but in the United Kingdom, we seem to spend years being taught areas of mathematics that would prove pointless to 99% of the class. Story 73. My child just finished elementary school, and it seems she spent a lot of time on the states of matter, life cycle of butterflies and amphibians. Important, sure, but it felt like many weeks were spent covering these topics. Story 74. How to play the recorder. I love playing music and was in band, but the majority of people who had to learn to play the recorder did not even enjoy playing music in their free time. I know it is not taught everywhere, but for many, it was taught as if it were an important lesson. Everything has a purpose, so I am trying to think of what people usually get the least amount of use from unless they focus on it. Story 75. I vividly remember in 8th grade they had us memorize the preamble and required us to recite it in order to go on to high school. What was that about? Story 76. I just wish I retained all of the information. It would have been great to learn about life skills such as doing taxes, booking appointments, and budgeting. Story 77. Poland. Religion. A bit of backstory. The Catholic Church took part in dismantling the communist regime. When the regime was removed from power, the Church received some rewards from politicians, such as restrictive abortion laws and the presence of religion in public schools. Story 78. Speaking as a teacher, the thing I most dislike is cursive. The United Kingdom curriculum states that from year 5 onwards, pupils cannot pass English unless they are consistently writing in cursive. I think this is unreasonable because I know many children whose handwriting is beautiful but not joined. I have to divert their focus from the actual content of their writing to make them write in cursive. Yes, it looks good and yes, it is faster than non-cursive for many people, but I am frustrated that it is treated as an absolutely crucial part of learning to write. There are more practical uses for trigonometry than cursive. There are more practical uses for knowing map symbols than cursive. Story 79, German guy here. I just hated it when we had to analyze and interpret poems and short stories in German class. I never needed these skills again. I guess you had to do this in your country as well. Story 80. They taught me the Pythagorean theorem but never how to cope with grief, heartbreak, or how to love myself. That feels like the real loss. Story 81. Forcing us to play an instrument in a band or orchestra. Well, maybe it was not completely useless. I did learn how it feels to be called lazy for not prioritizing someone else's trivial issues over my own needs. The band teacher was upset that I focused on trying to keep up with math and English instead of the assigned task during the year of the September 11th attacks. I try to have more empathy than the unpleasant band teacher. Story 82. I think it is different across countries, but here they had us learn all the different classifications of plants. Seed plants, ferns, and others. Additionally, we studied the complex names for how many carbon atoms bind to various other substances. Story 83. The arts. I can understand other general education classes as those might be useful in the future, but nobody has ever looked back and thought, damn, I wish I knew what Andy Warhol painted. That would come in really handy right now. With education today producing unseasoned potatoes disguised as high school graduates, I cannot see why learning to play the trumpet is required by schools, but learning how to manage a bank account or understanding how to properly have an argument is not. Story 84. The new math was a complete waste of time that demoralized school children when I was growing up. Story 85. Probably one of the few skills I was taught that is now obsolete is using logarithm tables. I was in middle school when calculators, mostly four-function, started to become common. We were taught how to multiply and divide using logarithm tables from a book and how to practice this skill. Most of us had calculators. Trigonometry tables were only useful for another 3 to 4 years. People said, but you won't always have a calculator. It is more likely to have a calculator than a book of logarithm and trigonometry tables or, surprisingly, a slide rule. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.